Thanks so much, everyone. I'd also like to just briefly acknowledge the traditional custodians of the reef, the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people whose knowledge and care of the reef has sustained it, and the communities that live alongside it for generations. The work I'm presenting today is a collaboration between myself, Matt Kernock, and Elizabeth Hobman at CSIRO. And it's drawing, again, as Danny said, on the regional report card social surveys that were done at the end of 2021. So I really wanted to acknowledge Matt and Liz's work, and also the work of the regional report card partners, particularly Annie Bauer-Civiello. If you remember Annie, working for Dry Tropics Partnership, who helped to design and sort of craft our question about hope. So this work is a bit of a preliminary exploration of what might influence hope for the future of waterways among communities in the reef across those 4 regions that Danny mentioned. So the wet tropics, dry tropics around Townsville, Mackay Whitsunday, and also the Fitzroy region. And my contribution to this work comes through a project called the UQ Reef Futures Project, which is a fellowship project that runs over 3 years. It started a year ago. And it's looking at, it's predominantly a qualitative project, looking at how does change in reef ecosystems affect people's well-being across the reef, across a number of regions. And increasingly, a lot of it, the project is really about ecological emotions and people's affective well-being. So we know increasingly that things like climate change in the reef affect not only how we physically feel, but how we emotionally feel as well. And some of those ecological emotions, and Kerry mentioned that this morning, those things and the way that we perceive and interact with the reef, those things are really fundamental to the way that we think about protecting it, and also to our own well-being and our sense of what is a meaningful life in the reef region. So a lot of this work has been about the idea of ecological grief, or negative emotions that are elicited by reef change, but increasingly also looking at hope, so the more positive dimensions of how people see the reef and their own experiences and aspirations. So what is hope? And I'm just going to pop over here so that I can see a little bit more of this slide. I think we've all got a kind of a sense of why hope is important to each of us in our own lives. So this is what the research says, that hope is important for a number of reasons. One is because it's important for our well-being. So it's important to have that sense of hope and also optimism. So that idea that the future is looking bright. So it can enhance our well-being. It can enhance our resilience after negative environmental events. So we know that in relation to bushfires in particular in Australia, there's evidence that hope helps us to bounce back and to be resilient mentally in terms of our mental well-being, mental health. And now we know, partly from Matt's work in the reef and work of others, is that hope can help to inspire some action for the reef, or stewardship, intention and behaviour, particularly if it can build on some of those social and cultural values and attachments to the reef that have been developed over generations. So hope is important for a number of reasons. It's important on its own. It's important because it contributes to our well-being and resilience. And it's important because ultimately we think it can help to protect the future of the reef. And I sometimes do get that question because a lot of this work is qualitative. Sometimes people ask me, well, what's the point of studying, environmental emotions when we could be just studying climate change and fixing the problem? And I had a really interesting conversation last year with someone in the Whitsundays who had this really complex kind of chat about grief and hope in the reef. And at the end, he said, well, I don't know if this is really going to help the reef, but probably can't hurt it. So I think sometimes it can seem a little bit esoteric to work on ecological emotions, but I think the more that we get into this, and particularly this hope work, I think there's some interesting insights about, well, what drives that? And then what can that do for us? So understanding hope and its links to reef attachment. So we're starting to understand a little bit. We don't have a lot of information about what drives hope or what might be associated with hope in the reef. But we have a few clues, particularly from the research about ecological grief, which I guess you can think of as sort of the flip side of environmental hope. And we know that a lot of it's driven by place, so place attachment, place identity, so things that contribute where an environmental feature or an ecosystem like the reef, particularly somewhere as iconic as the reef, where that contributes to your identity. If it's lost, you can kind of see why that might affect your sense of self and lead to a feeling of ecological grief. So place is a big one. We've also got people's perceptions of the environment, and as Danny said, perceptions of the way that the environment is being managed. Those things we think are also potentially really important. So we were lucky enough to be able to investigate that using that waterways data set, which was really big and diverse survey of more than 1,800 respondents. So we've got a nice big sample size to start to pass out some of those patterns across those 4 different regions. So we built a model. This is sort of the overarching model. It's a hierarchical regression, which just means really just adding in a number of different independent variables in stages to sort of understand, well, what proportion of variance is contributed by each of those different things. So we started out, we wanted to control for region. We also then built in some variables around pride and place dependence. And pride is one of the from the literature, from conceptual frameworks about place attachment, pride is right in there as an important predictor of how people value and attach to places. So we've got those. We're lucky that the data set, the survey was quite varied and allowed us to kind of look at hope in a really multidimensional way. We also then looked at the influence of environmental health, so the way people perceive the health of things like creeks and inshore coral reefs. Future threats to the health of the reef across different regions, and also governance variables. So whether people felt like they had an input, whether they were satisfied with waterway management, and whether they felt like they trusted science and trusted waterway management institutions. And by waterways, I should clarify that, and you saw in Danny's presentation, that it was very diverse. So it incorporated freshwater ecosystems, sort of higher up in the catchment, all the way down through estuaries to coral reefs and the ocean. So our dependent variable there is hope. We just measured it in using one construct. So I feel hopeful about the future of waterways in my region. So it's a very preliminary analysis, but I'm just going to take you through some of the headline findings and some of the things that I think are kind of interesting. So what we find is that there is not too much variation, but a little bit of variation in hope across the 4 different regions that we looked at. And there is actually a statistically significant difference between regions 1 and 4. So the wet tropics on average is a bit lower in terms of hope, perceived hope compared to the Fitzroy. And we wanted to kind of understand a little bit about what is driving that. It's hard to know that at the moment. We probably need some more qualitative work to really dig into that difference. But what we can see from our model is that a lot of hope is unexplained, actually. So it's still a bit of a black box. And partly we think that's because it's just a very, very complex picture that also includes people's social identity and other things that we can't measure at the moment through this particular data set. But it does tell us a few interesting preliminary things. And the one that really stands out to me at first is that relationship between pride and place dependence and hope. And actually what's going on underneath that is pride. So pride really was that pride in waterways is really strongly associated with hope, and it was the most important variable in our analysis. Ecosystem health, particularly the health of creeks and inshore reefs, which I'll show you in just a second, was really important. And also some of the trust and governance stuff as well, particularly satisfaction with waterway management and trust in management institutions. This is just showing you the proportion of variance that each of those steps is contributing to the model. So you can see here, just breaking it down a little bit into those kind of subcategories. Pride is really the number one, so it's contributing the majority of variance in our model. That's the most important thing. Health of creeks and inshore reefs are the other two that had statistically significant associations with hope. And, that's something we might expect in a survey about waterways, where people are potentially kind of focused on sort of freshwater ecosystems, but also reflects potentially the significance of inshore coral reefs as an ecosystem within the context of the reef region. Satisfaction with management on the left-hand side, and trust in management institutions were those 2 governance variables. And we looked at about 6 different aspects of governance. Interestingly, trust in science was not a significant predictor of hope. So yeah, maybe something to kind of dig into a little bit further. And the threat of climate change. So we looked at a range of different threats, including land use change in industry, as well as direct use impacts like fishing, recreation and tourism. And the only threat that's significant here was the threat of climate change. One of the things that I found really interesting when we were sort of pulling apart the data is that initially we thought, we'll just, when we're looking at threats, because we've got such a big model, sometimes what you do is clump things up to make it a little bit more parsimonious. And initially we thought, okay, we'll clump extreme weather and climate together because, you know, those two things sort of, you know, we think that they form a category, and actually they don't in our data. So there's a significant association between the threat of climate change and hope, negative association. So the more you perceive the threat of climate change, the less hopeful you are, but not for extreme weather. So those two things are not necessarily going together in the minds of people who are responding to this survey. So something to maybe look at in more detail. So in terms of the key findings, we know that environmental hope is potentially an important contributor to wellbeing. It can be a little bit difficult to get a handle on. We're trying to do that through a statistical method, but there are lots of different ways that we probably need to start to look at hope. We looked at, we used the regional report card survey data to look at the survey responses of 1,800 respondents. So nice and powerful across those 4 different regions. And you see some regional differences, but across the board, the hope is kind of measured, we measured it on a scale of 1 to 10. Thank you. And it's about sort of around about the 6 mark. So sort of medium-ish kind of hope for the future of the reef across all regions. We know that certain things are important, ecosystem health perceptions for particular types of ecosystems, pride, satisfaction with management, but about 60% of the variance in hope is unexplained. So we sort of think that it's probably, a lot of that is about social identity or people's individual hopefulness or optimism, and all of those things kind of contribute to the complex picture of hope. So watch this space for some more qualitative work trying to parse out some of those patterns. Thank you.